of Mars for all I care. But with the presidency itself, these last 3.5 years, the presidency itself has shown itself to be a captive seat. If we look at just in the last 2 weeks, Donald Trump talked about pulling out Afghanistan. Jamal, I know objectively you don't really like Donald Trump and how he speaks and how he conducts himself, but I know you wouldn't be against pulling out of Afghanistan, but we see what happened. I mean, we look at the Democratic congressmen, Congress people, and senators, and they all objected. Oh, no, we can't pull out of Afghanistan, and they pull this fake Russia bounty, and it's whenever you want to bring peace, whenever you want to, and I know majority of the country, majority of the people, you say, you know what, let's bring our soldiers home, let's bring some peace, let's stop killing X, Y, and Z. Most people would be in favor of it, but you see the machine that's really held captive the presidency. They don't want to let it go. They don't want to let it go, and we've seen how under attack this president's been from the day one he stepped in that office. So, whoever it is, it doesn't really matter necessarily. It's the other aspect. It's our congressmen, our senators, our governors, our mayors. It's these people who aren't temporary like the president. I mean, the president's temporary. He can only run 2 terms consecutively, and then that's it. So regardless of who wins, those people who still want war, who still profit off war, are still going to be there.
Thank you for the call, Rod. Shane, any response, or you want to go to the next caller?
No, yeah, absolutely response. I mean, the thing is that this would fit right into the conversation. We could have started, but it kind of would have dominated probably. I mean, you're talking about the presidency and this degradation in recent years, maybe recent decades, of the quality of the standards that we should hold our presidents to. This idea of the president as a role model for the country, as a sort of standard bearer for the American culture, all this stuff. I hear you. I hear you in abstract, but 2 weird pushbacks. One I've thought out less, and so I'll just put it out pretty tentatively. But one of these is maybe the president shouldn't be the supreme person par excellence. Maybe the president should be a pragmatic person chosen by people to try to solve problems that the country faces at the time. And maybe it's her focus on the presidency and on strengthening the executive branch, and by consequence, weakening both local government's ability to solve their own affairs, and weakening arguably the consistency and the competence of the legislative and judicial branches. I mean, political polarization doesn't just happen in the streets. Apparently it happens in the halls of Congress, because so many people have been deadlocked for so long. Now, there are a lot of things going into that. But again, this idea of the president as like the standard bearer, there's some merit to that. And again, this is pretty tentative, but maybe we should also loosen up a little bit on that. Maybe we should, another side of this, I'm just going to segue directly into my second point, which I've thought through a bit more, and so I can be a bit more confident about here. Barack Obama was the sort of exception in a weird way that proves the rule. That's not exactly right. Barack Obama was a sort of upstart young candidate who a lot of people didn't know about, a lot younger than especially the candidates we've seen since then. But he of course got co-opted. Even somebody who went through the system, who sort of learned to speak the language of the system, was inherently susceptible to the pressures of the institutions that they were brought up in. Those institutions, it's hard to get through them without being severely affected by this body of beliefs, body of practices that, again, if anybody who's going through that, especially the people who are going to become the quote unquote elites in our country, including the president, anybody who's going through that is going to have to suck up to those opinions as time goes on. Consciously and unconsciously, they're going to be deeply affected by it. And then what you get is a status quo that turns into a mental rigor mortis when they get put into office, because whatever personal convictions they may have, their underlying sort of rule set they've learned, the culture that they've been embedded in, and the obligations that they face as the president overwhelms them. And so
Agreed.
with Trump, there was this candidate who clearly was not a political player, except as it benefited his businesses. And a lot of people were looking up to that. Kanye is probably as far from Trump in terms of being a political player as Trump was from the candidates that he was facing, whether it was Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, whatever, Bernie Sanders even. So it sort of fits back into the first one. Maybe we don't need somebody who's going to be the standard bearer of the institutions that we would use to judge their success. Maybe we need somebody who has genuinely independent ideas. And whether or not actually Kanye gets elected, I don't think he would get elected this cycle. The fact, if he goes through and he starts to run, depending on how well he does, depending on what his issues are, depending on how he affects the conversation, I'm excited about that, man. That's huge. That's huge. He is we'll need to see more. But just the fact that he's pushing for it, the fact that it might actually happen is huge. It's going to have significant repercussions. What's your take on
All
that?
right. I don't. I am. I feel your. Look. I feel you, man. I feel where you're coming from. I get the need, the want, the craving for something different. This thing. I mean, because look, the public basically voted in Obama on a message of hope and change. Literally, hope and change. That doesn't mean anything. It's like a Pepsi commercial, but they had the feeling of it, and just like those Pepsi commercials with the bear, or those Coke commercials with the bear at Christmas, where they'll go rolling down the hill, and people are like, oh, and you associate the Christmas spirit with this object of Coca-Cola. The things aren't related, but you can put the feeling on it. I get it on that level of the hope and change thing, where it's like people want something fundamentally different, even to going for Trump for that matter. But I'm skeptical of the Kanye thing, but we'll see. We do have two callers though. Bushwick from DC. Bushwick, 30 seconds. Welcome to the show, Bushwick. What's going on? Okay, let's go to Bushwick. Can you hear me? Okay, let's go to the next one. Let's go to Lynn from Little Rock. Lynn, what's going on?
Good morning, everyone. I don't know if y'all know this, but yesterday, Supreme Court ruled that Donald Trump does have to show his taxes the last 8 years to the New York, a Southern District of New York. So I think this could be detrimental to his election, because no telling what they'll uncover in those 8 years of taxes that he has so adamantly not wanted to expose. Also about Kanye, I mean, Kanye's already too late to get on 7 states, so, I mean, there's just no way it's going to happen. He can't get on California or New York's ticket. That's quite a bit of, electoral votes right there. So Kanye is that's a no-brainer. He's not going to be elected. So
I'm going to push back. He did this Forbes interview a couple days ago that came out. He was addressing that. He was saying he has connections. He was saying that he has a way to potentially make that work. He did recognize it, but he's saying that it's as far as he can tell, it's technically not too late. He also, I'll just throw this out there too. It was apparently like a multi-hour long interview with Forbes, where he'd been hedging for the first hour on when he was going to run, because he didn't explicitly say in 2020. He could have meant 2024. At the end, about an hour into it, apparently he said, "No, he just doubled down. I'm going for 2020." So he's saying that he is running this time. I hear you though. Technically, like you're saying, there are some states where he just, as far as I can tell, that it's already been done. It's a fait accompli. There's nothing more that can be changed about it. You still there, Lynn?
Yeah, I'm here. Well, I mean, he's not going to be on the tickets in those states. It's already passed. I don't know what kind of connections he thinks he has, but he can dream all he wants, but he won't be on those tickets there. But also, I do believe this Trump and Supreme Court, that's going to really harm him when all that gets out. I don't know if they'll be able to get it out before the election, but knowing the Democrats, they probably will. So
thank you for the call, Lynn. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah,
I was just gonna say that's an interesting point. It's supposed, like you said, about the court. I just want to make the Kanye point. She has a good point, and maybe Kanye changed his mind during the interview, which kind of gets to my point about, is he really being serious? I mean, if he's in the middle of the interview, he's not really saying it, he's hedging, and all of a sudden it's like, no, I'm gonna do it. Maybe he made up his mind there. I guess that's what I mean when I said this just seems to be thrown out there. But again, I could be wrong on this, Shane. I could be wrong. But we'll see.
Yeah, I could see that be the case too. That's the thing. I'm not saying that is, but that's totally maybe 20-30%, something like that. Like, I'm not, again, when I'm defending the dude, if I am or whatever, it's just because I think that he would be a very interesting and arguably a productive candidate in the arena there. You know what I mean? It's not, he has all his personal quirks. There's a lot of stuff I disagree with. Another thing, right. You know what? Oh man, I don't even know if we have time for this. Yeah, we probably don't have time for this. The bit with the Confederate flag. Did you see where he was like wearing the jacket with the Confederate flag on that?
No, I didn't see that.
You got a lot.
I've seen it with the Trump hat.
Of flag. Yeah. No, the Trump hat, some would say, is worse. but he, not me, but some would say, but he got a lot of flack for this. I don't know. He's an interesting dude. He constantly plays with the Christianity, constantly plays with these religious ideas. And what I saw there, and this is controversial to say, is like, is he wearing the Confederate flag almost like Christians wear the cross? Like this was the object that I was crucified on. And now I'm trying to blame that. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, you bring that up now.
Exactly.
Let's go over to the next one. Yeah.
We gotta go into a break. We're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute with Benn Swann.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usually flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Finishing up an interesting conversation and moving on to even more interesting ones, I'd wager. We're joined now by Benn Swann. He is an award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and a host on the program Boom Bust, airing weekdays on RT America. Ben, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Hey, thank you for joining us. I just really quickly, briefly check in, just to sort of get my bearings here. What part of the country are you living in? We're out here in D.C. I'm in Virginia. Jamarl's over in Maryland. What about you?
I'm just south of you. I'm down in Atlanta, in Georgia.
Oh, really? Wow. That must be, yeah, that must be interesting. Anyway, don't mean to get lost on that.
It's an interesting place to be right now.
That's the thing. Yeah. Okay, so we brought you on to talk about a few things today. I actually wanted to get, but we can probably come back to this later. I wanted to talk with you about homeschooling, unschooling, home education, as it fits into the wider sort of school crisis related to coronavirus and reopenings, the details of how schools are going to be reopening. There's that issue too, but also just a sort of groundwork philosophical issue, bringing up your kids, what the best way to do that is. That's something that's been near and dear to my heart for a long time, but we can come back to that. What we brought you on to talk about first, hopefully we can come back to that later, is China preparing for U.S. sanctions on Chinese banks. Now, this was a story that I spotted the other day. It's something I've been thinking about a lot. How basically, if other countries have investments, liabilities, assets, et cetera, in the United States, we're imposing sanctions kind of left and right, both on an individual and a countrywide basis. That's, again, it's a potent arrow in our quiver. It's a tool that the United States has been using. But it's something that we've been using so often, it seems like we're starting to abuse it from my perspective. And it does beg the question, how is that going to affect this sort of international network of tenuous alliances and agreements that we have that sort of sustain not just our world order, but the United States' position in that world order? So with all that in mind, what have you been seeing? What have you been thinking about relating to this issue? What's your take?
Well, look, I think that what we're looking at between the U.S. and China right now is an acceleration of this. It's almost like a new Cold War between the U.S. and China right now, which is pretty shocking considering the fact that even just about a year ago, we weren't having any of these conversations. Now suddenly we have the FBI director coming out and saying that China is the greatest security threat to the United States, that they're having to deal with thousands of new cases of essentially economic espionage is how he referred to it from China over the years. We are seeing this ratcheting up of kind of the attacks against Chinese companies like Huawei. There's talk by the administration of banning TikTok here in the United States because it's a Chinese-owned company. I mean, it's a very interesting kind of moment in terms of that. I think you're hitting on a very important issue in terms of the banking part of it and specifically the sanction part of it, because when we see the U.S. move forward into sanctions, as we've seen, as you said, in so many other countries, sanctions are, I think, my personal belief is, and I think there are others who would see this as well, are an act of war. They are not an overt act of war, but they're certainly a covert act of war. And sanctions typically do not actually harm governments. They typically harm people within those countries. So in this case, when you try to make the sanctions a little more narrow, you try to hit either large companies or wealthy people. They're a little more targeted, so it's a little more helpful to go that route as opposed to harming the general population. But even then, there's always retaliation for that. What's more interesting about China versus other countries that we've done this with is that we don't have in Iran or Venezuela massive amounts of American jobs and corporations moving product through Iran or moving through Venezuela. We do have that in China. So I think it's very interesting to kind of see how this plays out. But I also think, and I've got a criticism here, a criticism for, when the FBI director is talking about China performing economic espionage against the United States, he referred to it as the greatest wealth transfer in modern history of money flowing from the U.S. into China. But you can't really blame China for all of that. I mean, where's the accountability for U.S. corporations that literally took millions of American jobs and moved them into China? First, obviously, through Mexico, through NAFTA, but then on to China. And so where's the accountability for those companies that have moved that wealth from the United States and into China, rather than just treating it like it's all China doing all of this on their own?
That's a good point.
Thinking about that, that's a very good point. And, many of the corporations have a incentive, just based natural incentive, in their pursuit of profit to move outside of the country and then allow those products to be brought back into the country, basically cheaply. I mean, we're talking about like the trade deals, NAFTA, or for that matter, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Obama was trying to push through, that most likely Biden will push through in a response to what they consider to be somehow curbing China. Is it possible to get those jobs back? Now, my thought is always the answer has to be no, because there's no impetus to get those jobs back. If the whole goal of the system is profit, well, the answer is no. But how do you even go about dealing with a situation like that, dealing with the issue of jobs and everything else that have been drained from the United States, since the natural incentive for those jobs is basically to go seek profit making?
Well, I think that becomes the issue. I mean, do you put into place essentially a national strategy that says the era of extremely cheap goods coming in from China or from Vietnam, Taiwan, is over. And essentially, if you do import goods coming from those other countries, we're going to place tariffs on them that are going to drive the price up because consumers will have to pay that. I'm not advocating for that, by the way, but I do believe that there is a kind of a movement happening right now, certainly happening in Washington, that I think a lot of folks had not predicted. And whether you agree with President Trump or not, you have to at least admit this, that these issues were not issues that were being talked about until he became president. Now that he is in the White House, he has pushed a strategy on China that, again, has shocked a lot of people. It has certainly been a strategy in this trade war with China that I think many people did not see coming. The question will be, I think history will judge some of it too. Is this a folly? Is it a foolish strategy in terms of essentially poking China to the point where we do engage in some kind of huge economic war with them? Or will this strategy prove to say the Chinese did become too influential? They did control too much of the U.S. economy. We did see corporations essentially bowing to what the Chinese were doing. And this move or series of moves by the president hit the reset button and change some of that. I think it's too early to tell what's going to happen because the whole thing is developing literally as we speak.
Another interesting component to throw in here real quick is the proposal released in the past few days, released yesterday technically, by Joe Biden, $700 billion in American products and research, kind of seen as a competitor to Donald Trump's America First policies agenda. It's interesting to see this parallel being set up, but to your point, this also seems of a piece with this larger push. Some would say a resurgence. Again, the 19th century, America's economic policy was dominated by what's now called the American School, which selective subsidization of key industries. You have these tariffs implemented. Those were a lot of where the government got its money was from those tariffs. So in some sense, it's intuitive for people to be moving back in that direction. But last I recall, just a couple of years ago, protection was still a derogatory term. It was practically an insult when you applied it to somebody's economic policies. And so it seems like we're in this weird, uncanny valley where we can't recognize what economic policies we have, should have, shouldn't have, that whole thing. What's your take on that?
I think that's exactly right. I think there's a lot of confusion about what the policies are. Again, one of the issues that we run into is it's difficult for people to remember this, but remember that in 2016, Trump as a candidate ran with a kind of a Steve Bannon approach to a nationalist ideology of bringing jobs back to America, strengthening the American economy, ending bad trade deals, and bringing jobs back. Now, obviously, with the USMCA replaced NAFTA, that's bringing zero jobs back to the U.S. It does nothing to actually restore jobs. A promise that the president had made, he's not keeping that promise. But what he's talking about is we made a better deal. Not really, maybe a little bit, but not really. It's basically the same thing. But the most important part of it is it does not bring jobs back to the country. The issue that we're going to see now with Biden as he runs against Trump is that he has to run on a very similar platform, because that was the most successful part of Trump's platform was we're trying to engage with workers who have lost jobs, with parts of the country that have been left behind while jobs have been outsourced and moved overseas. Those are very real problems that the American economy is facing. It's very real problems that the American worker is facing. Remember that when many of those jobs have moved away and George W. Bush was president, his big solution was everyone needs to learn how to work on the internet because that will be how our country moves forward, which of course was a ludicrous idea. It didn't work at all. And we're never going to keep up with countries like India that are, and even China itself, that are putting out tons of workers into that tech space who are far more advanced than we are. So I think what Biden has to do is he has to kind of try to bring back some of that language and create a policy similar to what President Trump had put forward in the first place. Now, there's been so much noise around Trump, it's hard to know, to separate that between the accusations of racism and white nationalism and all that. But if you separate out and really get into the facts of it, the facts are the economic message and the economic talk of restoring America was very popular among voters. It was very popular among key swing state voters. And I think Biden has to be able to pull some of those people.
Yeah, but is he doing that? Like when I listen to his joint plan, and it comes across kind of in an almost tone-deaf way. I mean, when you consider everything that's taken place, I mean, 30 million, 40 million jobs went up in smoke in like 2 months. And on top of that, you have all of this apocalyptic language around evictions. I mean, I think it was over like 32% of the public didn't pay its rent in July. Like, these are some really vicious trends that we're looking at, and it doesn't seem that Congress is on the ball at all and even trying to reconcile those things. So is Joe Biden really even speaking in the language that's necessary for him to pull those votes? And does he even have to, with the majority of the public voting for him just because of who he is? I mean, but just because he's not Trump.
Right now, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think Biden's saying anything right now. I think this is a candidate that maybe he's going to be the first candidate in U.S. history to not say anything, to not debate, to not speak, to hide out essentially until the election and hope that the dislike for his opponent is enough to get him elected, because he's really not exerting himself in any way that we've seen, at least in modern history, of aggressive presidential candidates when you're running against an incumbent, it's tough. It's always tough. You have to set forward a vision that says change course from where we are. So I agree with you. I don't think he's doing that. I think he's right now doing essentially nothing is what it feels like. Having said that, there is an issue separately with Congress. You are absolutely right when you say Congress is doing nothing right now about what we're looking at in terms of jobs that have been lost, in terms of unemployment. The answer that Congress has to everything is we'll just cut checks. And of course, there's no accountability in where a lot of that money is going, what companies are getting it, what individuals are getting it, and how do you move forward the economy out of this place? When you talk about, and I brought up a great point there, about so many Americans not paying their rent. Well, that's money that just disappears and dissipates into the atmosphere. There's a chain reaction as a result of that. If you as a renter or a mortgage payer don't pay, then either a bank is going to default or a landlord is going to default. There is a process.
That is the voice of Benn Swann. We'll be back with Ben in just a second. We've got to take a break. Great conversation. Just for people who've been listening in, Benn Swann is an award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and a host on the program Boom Bust. You can also follow him on Twitter real quick. Again, we'll have him in a minute, but just if you want to check his workout, on Twitter, Benn Swann, that's 2 N's, BENSWANN _. You got to finish with that underscore. You can also check his workout at truthinmedia.com, truthinmedia.com. We'll be back with Ben in just a minute.
Fault lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. This is the last 15 minutes of our week, and we're delighted to be joined for that last 15 minutes by Benn Swann, who is an award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and a host on the program Boom Bust, airing weekdays on RT America. Man, that is a fun program name to say, Boom Bust. A lot of alliteration. It's great. Anyway, we were talking about real facts here. We're talking about this sort of cascading domino effect of the rental crisis. We've talked recently with that about a few other people, including Richard Wolff. That's an interesting conversation. In just a couple of minutes, because we were going to be talking about schooling, but we'll see where this goes. There's also this issue we're, having to do with our geopolitics, having to do with banks. We sort of started, and I want to come back to this. Reuters has reported within the last couple of days on some anonymous sources from within Chinese banks who are talking about contingency plans they're preparing in preparation for the potential threat of significant U.S. sanctions. Specifically, there are different words you could use for this: expropriation, theft, claiming, whatever, of over $1 trillion, $1 trillion US dollars of liabilities that these four huge Chinese banks have in the United States. So in some ways, I'm just going to tie this back into it. You're talking about how our economy, the U.S. economy, is predicated on taking out loans, basically. It's predicated on sort of deferring our obligations, deferring our responsibilities to some unknown point in the future. And as far as I can tell, one of the most profitable sources of those loans, the way that we sort of do it, is in a weird way, we print out money, other countries get some of that money, and then they'll invest it in the U.S., and this ties us together in this interesting way. It makes us sort of mutually dependent on each other, but it also increases the likelihood of some severe whiplash. Now, if $1 trillion of liabilities that, owned by Chinese banks is claimed in the U.S., which it seems is the sort of worst case scenario they're preparing for, I could see, you brought up in the last segment, a lot of our industry is based in China. I could see a lot of things happening to those industries, whether it's being nationalized by China, trying to claim them, in exchange for this theft of their money. That's my little theory, and not even a strong one. I'm just throwing that out as an example of the kind of thing that I could see happening. But that does seem like the level of conflict that we're having to prepare for. And of course, that level of conflict would, as far as I can tell, invariably lead to an even greater level of conflict shortly after. What's your take on that whole issue, that big thorny mess of an issue?
Well, I think that we are facing where right now it looks like almost economic warfare that's ramping up between the U.S. and China. You are correct if you were insinuating this, that it could turn into an actual war. It could eventually trigger to that point. Certainly, and China is a much stronger nation than other nations that we have typically and traditionally done this with. So you do have to be weary of how far becomes too far in terms of some of these tensions. But the other major issue that I think the U.S. is not necessarily taking into account is the influence that China has in other places around the world, other economies. The U.S. isn't the only economy that's dependent on China, and we are very dependent on China for a whole host of manufacturing issues. But many other countries, certainly the EU and that bloc of countries in Europe, is dependent on China. They lean heavily into them. We see right now kind of a fascinating back and forth going on in the UK, where Huawei is being cut out of the 5G technology plan there after Boris Johnson said they would not be. Well, now it appears that they are, and it seems to be only happening at the behest of the United States. Well, in response to that, the Chinese government is saying there will be an economic price to pay for the UK for having done this. And it seems like there's a kind of a ramping up there. It's also important to note there's been a concerted effort really over the last decade by BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to break away from the U.S. dollar and to create banking systems that operate completely separate from the U.S. And so there has been an underlying infrastructure that has been developed really over the last decade to try to protect against this kind of thing. You said this in the first segment, because the U.S. has done this so often, because we've used this kind of force so often against countries to bend them to our will, there have been really legitimate systems being established to say we will be able to work around you and outside of what the U.S. is doing so that we are not so dependent. The other thing that China's done with their Belt and Road Initiative is they have taken on a debt for a lot of other smaller countries around the world and help them, in terms of building infrastructure, building roads in their countries. And if those countries default, then China really becomes a very powerful force in those countries as well. So that's been happening in a number of places as well. And that entire initiative was built just to undo some U.S. influence around the world.
Ben, with the Belt and Road Initiative, I found that to be really interesting also. This notion of trying to get influence, be it economic, and the moment that you have a certain degree of economic influence, of course, that translates into political influence into the various countries. What does it look like if China rebuffs these sanctions? I mean, after all, issues that are pertaining to Hong Kong are basically internal to China because Hong Kong is it's China, basically. And despite the characteristics that they might have done that were associated with Britain over time, they are still China. And at some point, it was always going to be reunified with China. What could be the response here that China could take if it didn't necessarily like the notion of U.S. putting sanctions on, or if it wanted to rebuff many of the other either European patsy nations that work in coordination with the United States when it goes about these processes?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that can happen. One is that remember that China is the second largest holder of U.S. debt in the entire world. So they actually could begin to call in debt. They could begin to sell off U.S. treasuries very quickly to try to harm the U.S. dollar. It's probably not a good idea to go to war with your biggest creditor and the country that holds so much of your debt and your bonds. So that becomes, I think, a very sticky situation. The other thing is that as we watch what's happening right now with the Chinese is that, they are certainly gaining influence in other places, but the back and forth between what's happening with mainland China and Hong Kong, so this national security law that the Chinese just approved that essentially, I mean, now let's speak, plainly about this. It's a terrible law. It absolutely locks down, freedom in Hong Kong. It says you cannot essentially dissent from government or from what Beijing says, or you can have your business taken away from you. You can be jailed because you're essentially seen as being part of an insurrection. It's a very serious law. But while that is happening and the Chinese are pushing this onto Hong Kong and the U.S. is furious about it, the U.S. is literally doing very similar things to the Chinese and the Chinese voices here in the United States. Certainly when we talk about, issues of the U.S. saying that China is gaining influence and has too much influence in what's happening in the U.S. So it's a little bizarre when you think about it that you have these two superpowers that are criticizing each other so heavily and wagging fingers at each other so heavily, but they're literally doing almost the exact same thing to each other within their own borders. It's a kind of a bizarre world. And so when you're in the U.S. and you see China as this huge threat, you have to understand that in China, they're seeing the U.S. the same way. And so when these two countries work together, it's always done with a great amount of caution, at least most recently it has been, because both are expecting that when they give each other a hug, you're looking for a soft place to stick a knife. I mean, that's almost how these two countries see each other right now.
That's an interesting point. And the question that you asked, well, really the issue that you raised, it leads me to wonder about something. How deeply do the respective leaders of these countries actually feel that the things that they're saying are true? Again, a lot of this can be seen as optics. A lot of this can be seen on the converse as sort of this realpolitik thing where you're sort of steering public opinion, you're giving justifications for the things that you're doing. And that, as far as I can tell, at least with the United States, is an open question. I'm not sure about with China either. It's just that's a broader thing. I'm actually sort of awkwardly stumbling around the point because I selfishly wanted to take the last few minutes of the segment to talk with you about homeschooling and unschooling. I was raised mostly as an unschooler. I went back into school briefly. Regardless, it's an issue dear to my heart. I hear you homeschool your kids, specifically you and your wife. Your wife homeschools your kids. Can you just talk about why you did that, why you think that's an important thing for you guys to do, and maybe for other people too, if they're considering it, what they should know about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually was homeschooled growing up. My wife and I, when we got married, that was something we committed to doing, and so we've done it together. We have two daughters who are now in college, and then our sons are all in high school, and we still do it. And so our girls are actually off of college, but as far as taking them all the way to college, that's the way we've gone about it. I think that during this coronavirus pandemic, what we're seeing is more parents are seeing that, number one, there is a huge value to homeschooling your kids in terms of the amount of work they can get done in a day. There was a Harvard study done that essentially showed that 1 hour of homeschool is the equivalent of 4 hours in a public school because the time is so focused and because you have that direct attention. I always believed very simply this, that no teacher, no matter how good a teacher is, and I believe there are great teachers out there, no teacher will ever be as invested in my child's future as I will be. Not every parent can say that. Not every parent's in a position to do that. And that's not a judgment on parents or criticism. It's just recognizing the reality. But in our case, we were able to do that. So that's the step that we've always taken. And I think that right now, more parents who maybe in the past thought this was something they couldn't do are now seeing that maybe it is a reality and maybe it's a little easier to do than they had previously thought.
There's one last sort of follow-up on this. I agree. It's an interesting thing. There's also the conversation, I used the phrase unschooling. That's different from homeschooling. We could get into that, but what I actually want to get into is this conversation. A lot of people would say parents might care more about their kids, but they're not as qualified as teachers to teach kids. As far as I can tell, that might be true, but it's also, in some sense, an opportunity. You as a parent can enrich your own mind. You can pursue these topics. You can do that with and for your kids. I'm curious to hear where you guys stand on that subject. If you're sort of leading your own lessons, what you think is important to teach your kids, just that whole cluster of issues. Sadly, it's going to have to be pretty short. We only have about 45 seconds, but in 45 seconds or so, what's your take?
So very quickly, I think that there's different ways to do it. Some parents build their curriculum themselves. We never did. We always used accredited schools that had curriculum built. We acted as tutors rather than the teachers, and they had accredited teachers they would send everything off to. But it is important for people to know that in that process, that when you forge and foment a learning atmosphere in your home as homeschooling parents, what you find is when this quote unquote school day is done, you continue to forge a learning environment in lots of other areas. And too often, parents think that learning has to happen outside of their home. When you do it inside your home, everything starts to become a learning environment, not just the school hours.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Great show, great week. We'll be back on the other side of this week. If you want to check out Benn Swann, watch Boom Bust on RT America. Regardless, we'll be back on Monday. I am Shane Stranahan. Very happy to be joined by Jamarl Thomas. Thank you. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, as always, thank you for joining us. Apparently, there are a lot of internet outages in this area of Maryland, and so that's why we were in and out. It wasn't our internet source kept dropping out. Supposedly, it was supposed to be over with at 10 o'clock, so hopefully it is over with now. I want to thank all of you for joining us. We've had a really good show this week. We've been able to put on really good guests, really good questions, and no complaints. Like, share, subscribe. You guys will see me in a few minutes. Thanks all. Bye-bye.